It was big news when a giant cruise ship capsized at sea. 10 years later, it was completely abandoned and still lying on the underwater rocks where it was stranded. Two young divers, Mike and Jeff, decided to get a look inside, but they never expected to find what they found inside. When Jeff and Mike entered the cruise ship, they suddenly heard a loud scream in the distance. Mike looked at the rusty old door. He knew the scream came from in there. Unfortunately, it was locked, so they had to try and break it open. Jeff looked around him with his flashlight to see if he could find a pipe of some sort, when he suddenly saw a big crowbar lying on the ground. Jeff quickly picked the crowbar up and ran back to the door. He leaned back, knowing he only had one shot at getting this lock open, and slammed the crowbar down onto the lock. A loud bang thundered through the ship. The lock fell to the ground, and Mike quickly flung the door open. They could not believe what they saw inside. Now the screaming suddenly made so much sense to them. They knew they had to call the police immediately. But what did the divers find on the cruise ship? Where did the strange screaming come from? And why did the police need to get involved? Jeff and Mike knew that nobody was allowed near the half-sunken cruise ship, but they did not care. From the moment they saw it, they wanted to get on it to check it out. And so, the young divers set out in the early morning when nobody was going to stop them. The ship didn't look very sturdy, and who knew what they would find inside? It could be very dangerous, and if something happened to one of them, there was no way they would get back to shore in time. But Jeff didn't listen. He had already started looking for a way inside. As the ship was tilted, part of the upper deck lay in the water, so they could climb onto it and search for a door. But they had to be very careful. One slip-up, and they would slide straight into the water. Jeff fastened their boat to one of the cruise railings and gave one final look at Mike. But Mike just sighed and shook his head. He intended not to go inside, but once he saw Jeff climbing up the deck, he knew he couldn't leave him on his own. So he took a deep breath and went after Jeff. If only he knew then what a bad idea that was. As soon as they stepped inside the cruise, they could feel the eerie atmosphere of the ship. It was silent and dark, and the only sounds were the creaking of the metal framing and the lapping of the water. "Wait up!" Mike yelled as he ran after Jeff. His voice echoed through the remote halls of the ship. As Jeff and Mike explored the abandoned cruise ship, they came across many rooms, each with its own eerie atmosphere. Some rooms were locked, but luckily for them, not all were. They first entered the main hall, which was grand and spacious, with high ceilings all around and a large staircase leading up to the upper decks. However, the room was dark and dusty, and the furniture was covered in cobwebs. They could see the harrowing signs of neglect and abandonment everywhere. They then moved on to the cabins, which were small and cramped, with 2 or 4 beds in each room. The beds were unmade, and the sheets were stained with mildew and mold. They could see suitcases still open and clothes strewn around the room, as if the passengers had left in a hurry. As Jeff and Mike walked through the empty halls of the ship, they suddenly heard a strange noise. "Did you hear that?" Mike said with a trembling voice. But Jeff seemed unfazed. He just shrugged his shoulders and moved on. But Jeff would soon find out what was really going on. After a little while, Jeff wanted to go down even further to the lower parts of the ship. There was a small stairway that could lead them there, but it was pitch black. So they got out their phones and used their flashlights to guide them. As they got lower, the noise started to get louder. It sounded like a faint, muffled scream, and it scared the life out of both Jeff and Mike. They looked at each other with fear in their eyes, but knew they had to go further to investigate. Suddenly the staircase ended, and they were in the mechanical section of the ship. They could hear the water dripping down, and there was a little layer of water they had to walk through. They tried to be as quiet as possible so that they could follow the muffled sound, but the sound echoed through the ship, making it even harder to locate. They walked deeper and deeper into the ship, and Mike was full of anxiety. He knew they could never find their way back if something happened to them. Different worst-case scenarios shot through his mind as he gazed over the wet and rusty walls of the ship. What had he gotten himself into? After walking for a little while, they finally reached an end. They knew they couldn't be at the bottom of the ship, so why was there a dead end? Then Mike noticed something. "There," he pointed. "I see a door." Jeff grabbed the handle and pulled as hard as he could, but the door was stuck. He put his ear against the door and listened closely. "The sound is definitely coming from in here," he said. Mike stood beside him and also put his ear against the door. "I can hear it, but how will we get in?" Suddenly they heard something that almost made their hearts stop. A boat was approaching the ship, and they could hear muffled sounds of men angrily speaking to each other. "It sounds like they're getting onto the cruise ship," Mike said. "I knew this was a bad idea." They knew they had to act fast. They rushed back to the stairwell, but as they started to walk upstairs, they heard loud footsteps coming down. Quickly, they turned around, switched off their flashlights, and hid behind the stairwell. They held their breath as the men came closer and closer. The sound of the heavy footsteps on the metal staircase thundered through the ship. They watched as 3 men came down the stairs and walked straight to the locked door. As the men opened the door, the muffled scream got louder. Mike got a glimpse of what was going on inside and whispered, "We have to get out of here, quickly." Jeff looked at him with a worried look on his face. "What did you see, Mike? Who was inside that room?" But Mike didn't say anything. That scream sounded like it came from a woman. Mike sighed, knowing Jeff was right, but the situation had just gotten a whole lot worse. Those men didn't just outnumber Mike and Jeff. They were also a lot bigger and stronger than them. And to make matters even worse, Mike noticed one of them carried a gun.